Welcome to episode 23 of the Princeton Podcast with Mayor Mark Freda. In this episode, Mark sat down with Shirley Satterfield, educator, renowned local historian, and founder of the Witherspoon-Jackson Historical and Cultural Society. Shirley discussed her family's six-generation history here in Princeton, shared some experiences of her early education at the Witherspoon School for colored children on Quarry Street, and recalled some of the difficulties she witnessed during the Princeton School District's integration efforts in the 1950s. Shirley's early career as a teacher and later as a guidance counselor in Princeton area schools, her extensive accomplishments in preserving and sharing the history of Princeton's African American community, and her life history of devotion, education, and historical preservation are impressive. So without any further introduction, let's join our host, Mark Freda, and his guest, Shirley Satterfield, for episode 23 of the Princeton Podcast.
Shirley, thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure, truly. So let me ask a question that I think helps set the tone for our entire discussion. Shirley, how many generations of your family have lived here in Princeton?
As far as I know, 6 generations. My grandmother's oldest sister, Margaret Van Zant Blackwell, was born on Edge Hill Street, the oldest street in Princeton, in 1875. So I know that it had to go back further than that. So I would say the early 70s, 1870s.
That's a while. That certainly is. Yeah. So, Shirley, can we talk briefly about your early school years in Princeton? Because I know the school system changed when you were younger. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could explain what that was, how it happened, and,
Okay, I started in kindergarten. Actually, I was in kindergarten for 2 years. I went to afternoon kindergarten when I was 4 and morning kindergarten when I was 5. I didn't stay back. That's how it was. And I went to Witherspoon School for colored children, which was then on Quarry Street. It started on Witherspoon Street in 1858, and then it moved to Quarry Street. And they wanted to call it the Quarry Street School, but they continued to call it the Witherspoon School for colored children. We didn't call it that. We just said we go to the Witherspoon School. Mm-hmm. But to denote the difference because of the segregated Princeton, that's why they added for colored children. So I was there in kindergarten, and my teacher was Mrs. Potter. I remember all of my colored teachers. And Mrs. Potter, it is now the Waxwood, but I know that my kindergarten room was in the basement. And I remember there were tiles all over, beautiful tiles of the ABCs and nursery rhymes. But the closet was a whole length of the wall. And I don't know what it was, but Mrs. Potter would always put me in that closet and close the door because she said I was bad. And I don't even remember what I did other than hold hands with Roddy Pinnell under the desk in kindergarten. But I went from kindergarten to 3rd grade. And kindergarten to 2nd grade. And when I was in 2nd grade, Governor Driscoll, who was then governor of New Jersey, passed a bill that all schools in New Jersey had to be integrated. So the PTA of Princeton and the Board of Education got together and said, well, let's integrate the borough schools in Princeton because we were borough and township then. Mm-hmm. And the township actually paid the borough for their colored children to come to Witherspoon rather than to come to school in township. So when they integrated the schools, then Witherspoon became the middle school. We called it the junior high school for all students in the borough. And then those in the township went to Valley Road. And Nassau Street School is a building where next to Thomas Sweet is now part of the university. Yep. And they still have on the top, I think it says Nassau Street School or Nassau Elementary School. That's where I went from 3rd grade to 5th grade. Now, they called it integration. It was integration on the outside, but unfortunately, they didn't sensitize the teachers. There was no sensitivity training. There was no racial diversity. So we weren't even, I'll never remember being told that they were going to integrate the schools. Our parents knew, and our principal, Mr. Waxwood, Howard Waxwood, and the principal of the Nassau Street School, who was Dr. Chester Stroup, they got together to try to make it a smooth transition. But unfortunately, our education went down because the teachers taught us differently. They thought that we were less than the students who were already there. the white students whose parents did not want them to come into our neighborhood to go to school sent their girls to Miss Fine's school, which was a private school for girls. Yeah. And the boys went to Princeton Country Day, which is on Broadmead next to the university area. And in the 60s, it became Princeton Day School. So that was my experience. And then when I was in 6th and 7th grade, I went back to Witherspoon. And I had my cousin Sarah Harris, who everybody who's over 60 knows who Sarah Harris is. And she told me, I had her for math and science. And she said, you can't call me Cousin Sarah, you have to call me Mrs. Harris. So I remember going back and having some of my same teachers, but some of them had gone to the Nassau. And there is a 21-minute video called Princeton Plan 50 Years. And Dr. Stroup and I had actually gone to talk to the Legal Defense Fund about it in 1998. And they made a video about it. I don't know whether you've seen it or not, but it tells about the integration and how Henry Pinnell and I felt, and how a white guy who was 2 years ahead of me, how he felt. He thought it was the greatest thing. So that was my experience. And there were some things that were said by teachers that made us feel very inferior, and it continued to Princeton High School. So, but you're just that I can go on and on and on about the education.
I hear you, but I think what's important, Shirley, is to point out is that even though the schools were quote unquote integrated, as you point out, the teachers were not all the teachers were fully behind that. And if they, as they did, treat black students different than white students. Mm-hmm. So then they were putting the black students at a disadvantage.
Right.
So for all those years, that's a problem.
Right. The good thing, well, not the good thing, but Dr. Stroup realized that when students came from Witherspoon School, their test scores went up because we were really taught. And, it wasn't just the academics. And we were taught how to be proud. We were taught about our history. So we went there with the knowledge, but they didn't recognize it, So, yeah.
Yeah,
But it was a good experience. We got along with the students. At that time, there were Princeton was not just our community was not just African American. There were Italians here, and they were our neighbors, and they were very good friends that lasted with us forever. So the kids got along, except when we got to high school and they started using the N-word. But yeah.
No, my grandparents lived in the same neighborhood, so.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So we all go back.
That's right.
We're all connected.
Absolutely.
And we should be happy that we're all connected.
Yeah.
So just to talk a little bit more about your education. So I know after the high school, you went to 2 different colleges.
Mm-hmm. I went to, actually at Princeton High School, I never saw a guidance counselor. And in fact, I didn't even know what an SAT was when I graduated because they tracked us. And they tracked us in general, academic, commercial, and industrial. And when I was in 8th grade, sitting on the floor at Witherspoon School that was in the junior high, I was called to the office. I was in gym. And when you're called to the office in those days, you're in big trouble. So everybody said, Shirley's in trouble. And when I went there to the office, my mother was sitting there with the assistant principal to change me from general to academic, because they put us all in it, which meant you took general courses and you got out of high school. So if we weren't put in academic, we would not have gotten an academic diploma. So I took academic, but actually I did change it. I changed it to commercial because I like typing and all of that. So since I didn't see a guidance counselor, I had no idea where to go to college. And my mother had gone to Rider to take shorthand, but Rider then was in Trenton. There wasn't a campus there then. So I went to Rider, getting on the bus, I don't know how many days a week at Palmer Square, and going into what was then the bus station on Quarry Street in Trenton. I hated every bit of it. And my friend Minetta, who was Florence Broadway's sister, she was going there for medical secretary, and I was going there for secretarial science. It was a 2-year program. And the thing was that I would sit in shorthand and try to do those strokes. And then we had to go to typing because we had to translate transpose what was on our, and I had no idea what was on that paper. So I'm sitting there looking at everybody typing. Well, basically, I flunked out of Rider because I did not like it. And I didn't know that much about it. But I was with a friend who was a year behind me, Frances Moore, and she had all these college applications on her table at her home. And I saw one for Bennett College, not knowing anything about Bennett College. And people said, well, Bennett College is a Vassar of the South. So my uncle and my cousin and my mother and almost everybody in the family helped me with this application. And that's how I got to Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina. And then I took elementary education. And that's where I actually sat with the Greensboro 4 to open up the counter at the 5 and 10. And we were trained to be nonviolent by SNCC and CORE and all of those organizations that were for civil rights at that time. And we had to sit at that counter and we couldn't move, but they threw us off the stools. They spat at us. They threw things at us. They called us names. And being nonviolent was pretty hard,
Sure.
So I put that under my hat that I was part of that movement to open up the 5 and 10s in Greensboro. And that was 1960. Way before you were born.
Just a little after I was born, actually, but no one heard that.
Yeah.
Right. What a shame to have to go through that, but good
so that
for you.
was my education. And actually, when I came back to Princeton, I could have taught here. But so many people in my family were teachers, and they were telling me what to do because that's what families do. And everybody in the community was taking care of me. So the principal of a school in Las Vegas, Kit Carson, had come to interview when we were at Bennett, because they interviewed for careers.
Sure.
And my friend Tish Fish, who lived on Birch Avenue and was a year behind me, she was going to Las Vegas. The principal called me and asked me, and I said, Ma, can I go to Las Vegas? And so she and another friend who lived in Connecticut and I got on that plane, and we went to Las Vegas. And we actually bought a house for $99 a month, which was $33 a piece. But I remember, because I didn't want to go because I thought it was like in a desert. I had no idea about Las Vegas. But when we landed in all that heat and I saw the Strip, I said, well, here I am. So I taught in Las Vegas. That was my first teaching job. So, yeah.
Wow. Quite a ride there.
Yes.
And then I know that I believe you went back to actually get your master's degree at some point. So what?
Yes,
what
I went to Trenton State, which is now the College of New Jersey, and I got my master's in guidance and student personnel. And then I was teaching after I taught in Las Vegas, I got married and we moved to Syracuse because my former husband was getting his doctorate in polymer chemistry. And then we moved to Murray Hill and I taught in Summit. And I became a merit teacher when I was in Summit. And then we moved to East Windsor, and I taught 7th and 8th grade at Krebs School and Rogers School. I taught English and history. And while I was teaching, I was getting my degree at Trenton State. And after I got my degree, luckily there was an opening at Hikestown High School. So that's where I was a guidance counselor. And we were in houses, and each house had a house leader. And I was counseling 9 through 12. And after about 4 years of counseling, the board decided that they would have each house one grade. And my house had all seniors. So I'm counseling over 400 seniors. And I didn't know how I did it, but they were the ones that I had to get ready for college. And parents were actually getting outside counselors because they thought I couldn't do that. Well, I did. And I had wrote all those recommendations for those going to college. But at that time in Hikestown, many of the students were not as college bound as they were later because it was a farming area. Yep. And most of the students got out of high school and then worked on the farms or maybe have gone to junior college. But there were a group of people from New York who lived in an area called Twin Rivers. And they changed the whole educational system of Hikestown. And there were students who actually were able to go to noted colleges. And one of my students, he was the valedictorian, and he was not accepted to Harvard. And I drove to Harvard. And I said, you have to let me know why he was not accepted. So he put 3 applications. They said, this one is the same as this one, is the same as this one. I said, well, what about my student? I think what it was is that Hikestown High School had not been recognized as if he had gone to Princeton or West Windsor. he probably would have gotten in. So I struggled to work to get these students in, and I would take them to visit colleges. And through my summer vacation was to visit every state in New England and every college in every state. And I would stay at one of those colleges so that I could let them know we have students at Hikestown that can come to these schools. So, and then in 1993, I was called to the office, at the board office here in Princeton to be the head of a desegregation program. And I had no idea what the desegregation program was. It turned out to be Princeton Young Achievers. And they wanted me to be the head of it. And while he was asking me that question, the superintendent called me in his office, and he started asking me questions. I said, this isn't the same questions. They're not asking me the same questions. Well, what it turned out to be is they wanted me to come to Princeton to be a guidance counselor. And the only reason I left Hikestown was I was coming home.
There you
so
go.
that's how I got to come to Princeton High School.
Jeez. Yeah, great story.
Yeah.
I also went to Trenton State College.
Yes, I know.
So,
my mom remembers you too.
Yeah.
My mom loved you.
Your mother was a great woman, and I served for many years on the board of the Princeton Housing Authority with your mother.
Uh-huh.
Your mother was a tremendous person,
Yeah,
as you are, so it obviously
Thank
runs
you.
in the family.
Thanks.
So everybody knows you as the local historian of so much. So all that you have in your head, is there some effort for you to put this in writing or have some people tape this, or what is the plan to keep all the information that you have?
Okay. When I started this, can I go back and tell you how I started it?
Please do.
Okay. When I came back home, I was three of us were commissioned by our pastor at that time, who was Reverend McFarland, to research the history of our church. So the three of us kind of divided it, and mine started with the history of Paul Robeson's father, Reverend William G. Robeson. And when I did the history, and it does have to be written, I do have all the research. I spent years and years in the theological seminary. And then when I was on the board of the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia, I did research there because they actually had the information. It wasn't on microfiche. So that's how I started. And then I was asked by a woman whose name was Alice Brees to join the Historical Society of Princeton, and that was in 1990. And I'm looking around and I said, I feel like a fly on the wall. They're talking about white history, but what about from Jackson Street down to Birch Avenue, where we sustained all of Princeton? So there was a woman whose name was Gail Stern. And Gail Stern was she became the executive director of and she recognized the Italians and the African Americans in Princeton. And that's when we started knowing there's really diversity in Princeton. So in 1995, I think it was, we did an exhibit of the Italian Americans in Princeton. And the next year we did an exhibit of African Americans in Princeton. And that's when I worked with them on that. And actually Paul Robeson Jr. I introduced him because he came to the opening. And when the exhibit was over, I said, well, we can't stop here. And that's when I trained people who at that time were older than I to do the walking tour. I said, we have to start a walking tour so people will know they won't stop at Wigan Street. They'll know that from Wigan Street down to Birch Avenue, there is history. So that's why I started the walking tour. And at that time, there were only two people. I don't know if you know Jackie Swain, but she was working then at the university.
Yep.
And she and I were the only ones who were doing this. And for a while, she was working with me. And then I was just doing it on my own because I couldn't get anybody else to walk. When I was at Princeton High School, I started to get my students, people in the community. But I did that, started that walking tour. And, people in Princeton had no idea. They would stop by Paul Robeson's house, didn't know who Paul Robeson was. Or I would always start at the university because the Historical Society was then at Brain Beach House.
Right.
So I would say, we're going to cross Kings Highway and we're going to go to the university first. And they said, well, why are you going to the university if you're talking about the African American community? I said, because the first 9 presidents were not only slave owners, they were all Presbyterian ministers. And that's how we started. I mean, slaves were here before then, but this is how we started. So, and then I tell them to look across the street, and I talk about Palmer Square, which was Baker Street, and how we were moved. That was our first urban renewal, and how we were moved down to Birch Avenue. And then we come into the African-American community. And if I did the complete tour, it took 3 hours. And you should see people, by the time they got to Birch Avenue, was coming up Witherspoon Street, they were tired. And they would say, but this is a hill. I said, yeah, that's why we called it going uptown. We never called going up to Nassau Street downtown. It was always going uptown. But that's how I started with the history. And then after the tour, I said, well, we can't stop here. And that's when I was on the Historic Preservation Commission. And I brought up the idea this is a historic place. It needs to be a historic district. And that's when we started working on that. And 7 people sat in my dining room almost every week. And we worked on this, and we would meet with the council, we would meet with the zoning, we would meet with people who didn't want it to be a historic district because they couldn't change what they wanted to change. And so it did. We were a historic district in April 11th, 2016. And then I said, well, we can't stop here. And that's when I started, what else did I do? Oh, I tried to do, I worked with Hillier, because Mr. Hillier is our treasurer, to get plaques. And then we started the plaques, because I said, these are places that will no longer be here. And if you notice, every plaque shows the original picture of the buildings. Right. Or the people there. And so that's why it's so important that they are done, so people will know. And then there's an architect at Hillier Studio who has done the brochure so that people can do their own walking tour. And eventually it'll be so you can turn on your phone or whatever. And like you do at a museum, you'll stand in front of the plaque and you'll be told the history of it. And thank you very much for your plaque.
Oh yeah, it was my pleasure.
Thank you so much.
The walking tour is a great thing, and everybody that's listening should at some point go do it. It's very interesting. You'll learn a lot about the town.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So let's just talk for a second. You're involved in so many things, Shirley, but so I can't even list them all. But let's just talk about the Witherspoon-Jackson Cultural and Historical Society. So how did that get created?
That started even before the plaques. That was the other one, yes. Yeah. I wanted to start an organization to collect and preserve and share and appreciate and respect the history of African Americans in Princeton. So I called Leighton. I said, Leighton, I can't do this by myself. So we did form an organization. And it was, I don't know if you know Dr. Joanne Cunningham,
yes,
who lives in Princeton,
yep.
And she was a professor at William Patterson, and her son went to Princeton High. Reverend McAlpin, David McAlpin, who was our treasurer, and unfortunately we have lost him.
Yes.
And he's our mayor emeritus. Dr. Robert Rivers, who went to Princeton University, he worked at Princeton University when he was younger, went to Princeton, has a walk named after him, and his picture's hanging up in some building there. He's now he's now emeritus. He was our vice president. Leighton Newland, who is now our councilman. Antoine Newland, who was Leighton's nephew. Ashley Hightower. There are 2 young members. Yep. Both of them grew up in Princeton. Patricia Leslie Harvey, who lives in Willingboro, but she joined us. And the reason she joined us is because she and a friend who grew up in Princeton actually said, your house needs to be a museum. So my friend Joyce Sinkler, who actually lives in the house where that florist shop is now, right up the street, yep. That her father built that house, Mr. Sinkler, who was with the recreation. Yes, yes.
Bob's a great guy.
Right. Well, she came to my house every week, and we categorized everything on the first floor of my house. And it actually was a 501c3. It was called the Van Zant Moore May House, because my grandmother is a Van Zant, and then she married a Moore who drowned at Carnegie Lake, and then she married a May. So it was going to be a museum. And my daughter said, you're kind of old to be living upstairs and having people come through your house. And I did take a course at Rutgers on how to make your house a museum, but all that you have to go through, the zoning, the cost, I said, there's no way. Yeah. So the organization that was started that's what we're doing. We have had interviews, we have had fundraisers. Our first fundraiser was the man who came to speak at the Arts Council, who wrote a book about the Green Book, and you know about the Green Book.
The Green Book, yeah.
And there are 3 places in Princeton that are listed in the Green Book. So that's how I started the organization, and it is flourishing. We have a newsletter. If you go to the internet and do Princeton WJHCS, WJS, whatever. I could never get Witherspoon-Jackson Historical and Cultural Society.
WJCHS.
Thank you, .org. And then you will see our newsletter. Yeah. And we've highlighted many people who are in Princeton, and it's really a good newsletter. And Julian is our editor, and he's one of the architects at Hillier Studio. And of course, Mr. Hillier. Mr. Hillier is our treasurer. And we were meeting at the Studio Hillier until the pandemic, and now we do it by Zoom.
Let me hit another organization that you're part of. And again, we can't hit them all, but you're I think you're still on the board at the Paul Robeson House of Princeton also, right?
Yes. That house is very important, not just because Paul was there, but also a lot of people who came to Princeton boarded there, as many houses in Princeton where people could not stay. And Mrs. Taylor was the last person to live in that house, Mrs. Gladys Taylor, and she was a seamstress, and she went to our church, and she was a member of the family. And when we wanted to get the Robeson house, Mrs. Taylor was bombarded by realtors. Mm-hmm. And one of those realtors was going to get her, and the house was not going to be there. And we said, well, how can we encourage her? So Bernadine Hines and I, because both of us grew up in Princeton on the board, and we went to Mrs. Taylor and we almost begged. I said, Mrs. Taylor, this house is very important to us in Princeton. And I guess it worked because then we started working on it, which was, back in 27, whenever it's much earlier. So then there's a board now that, as you know, and we're working on it. And I was on Princeton Future at that time. In fact, I was on it when it started with Dr. Goheen and Dr. Geddes and Sheldon Sturgis, because it started with Mr. Hines and I showing slides then, and people were going to sleep. Slides are very boring. I'm glad I got a PowerPoint now. But Mr. Hines and I talked about the African-American community, and I joined the board, the Princeton Future. And then when Kevin Wilkes came on, and I knew we were doing the Robeson House, I asked Kevin if he would be the architect. So it's coming along. It's, yeah.
Yeah, no, a lot of work is being
But Paul Robeson was born in that house, but he was born in 72 Witherspoon because it was a double house. And there weren't many houses on Witherspoon Street at that time, so that was 72. It's now 110.
Yeah.
And he was born in 72. But he lived in the house on Green Street longer than he lived in the one on Witherspoon. But we're using that one because that's where he was born. Yeah.
Okay. So another activity I think that's near and dear to your heart is your church, the Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church.
Mm-hmm.
You're very involved there also. Mm-hmm. So what haven't you done at that church? You've done so many things.
Well, I do the history of the church, and I know you know the history as it started. Can I tell you quickly about the history?
Absolutely.
Okay. Nassau Presbyterian Church was then First Presbyterian Church. Started in 1766. And the first minister was John Witherspoon, who was then the sixth president of Princeton University, and who, by the way, also owned slaves. Throughout their history, there's been 3 fires. And the first fire was in a closet that the sexton had put something in, and it caused a small fire. No, that was the second one. The first one was the Hessians, who at the Battle of Princeton used the pews as firewood. That didn't destroy the church, but they used the benches. The third fire was the 4th of July, and an ember from one of the fireworks hit the roof. But it was the second fire that destroyed the church. And at that time, the slaves worshipped in the gallery, in the balcony. Mm-hmm. And the white parishioners went to the theological seminary, which is also Presbyterian, and that's where they worshipped. balcony wasn't going to carry all those black people that were slaves. So 90 of the 100 and some slaves came down Witherspoon Street and started a church of their own. Now, our church was not there then. This was in 1836. So I assume that they may have worshiped with the Methodist Church, the Mount Pisgah AME Church, because they had already started in 1832. So when our church was built by two men from New York, and then they had their place of worship. But we didn't declare it our history until 1840, because that's when Mr. Lowry, who was a trustee at the First Presbyterian Church, gave us our first communion. So that's why we use 1840 as our beginning. And my family was in that church since the 1870s. And it started with Frank Van Zandt, Frank Van Zandt was my grandmother's brother, who was superintendent of Sunday school. Also, Elizabeth Betsy Stockton worshiped in our church, and she started a Sabbath school in our church. And everybody says Betsy Stockton. Her name was Betsy because that was a nickname. That was a Betsy in the Stockton family. Her given name is Elizabeth. So on one of our windows says Elizabeth Stockton from her scholars or something like that. So we have a window dedicated to her. We have a plaque dedicated to her. And outside of our church, we have a plaque that I wrote for the historic preservation of New Jersey, because there are trails of all noted women in throughout New Jersey, and that one's for Betsy Stockton. But anyway, when my grandmother was a faithful religious person, and on Sunday, we didn't do anything but go to church. And she always had a pot of beans for anybody who came by. And I lived on Old Clay Street at that time. I grew up on Old Clay Street until they built the Clay Street that's there now. And all of my family were either deacons or elders or some part of the church. And my cousin Sarah, her mother played the organ during Reverend Robeson's days when he was the minister. And then she played for 42 years. And cousin Sarah took over for 38 years after that. So they were the ones who were the organists and the choir directors. And my grandmother was on everything in the church. She was the ladies' aide, the pastor's aide. She used to walk from Princeton to Rocky Hill, not Rocky Hill, but to what's 27, going on 27 to Kingston, to get to go to Mapleton Farms to get vegetables for the Harvest Home dinners. And then somebody would see her walking back and they would drive her back home. So, but my grandmother, Annie Mae, everybody in Princeton knew Annie Mae. But and when I left Princeton, I wasn't going to church very much. But when I came back home in 1981, I was right back at church. And I was the superintendent of Sunday school. I taught Sunday school. And I started back Westminster Fellowship, which I was in when I was a teenager. And then I started the junior usher ministry. And thank you for reading the proclamation and for being there for our junior ushers for their graduation.
My pleasure.
So I've been with the junior usher ministry for years. And I think I'm going to have to give it up because I have to pass it on to another generation. But yes, I'm a deacon. They wanted me to be an elder, but I'm not a good ruler as I am taking care of people. So I'm a deacon. I'm on the chancel committee. I'm the head of the chancel committee that sets up communion and makes sure the paraments are the right colors. I'm on church life. I'm on several committees. I got my grandma in my blood.
You do.
Yeah. Our church was renovated in 1998, and we worshiped at the Theological Seminary Chapel. And they were going to take the original pews out of our church. And Cecilia Hodges and I were two women trying to fight to keep those pews. And but it didn't work. And the day they took out the pews, I just stood there, watched, and tears just came down because I knew how important. I had historians and carpenters come and look at those pews and said, keep the pews. But they left. So I had 4, and they were put in storage, but I had 4 of them taken out to put in our fellowship hall. I have one in my dining room that my grandmother sat in. I have one at the high school in the guidance department when I was a guidance counselor, and they restored that pew. They had a regular ceremony. Were you there?
No, I missed that one.
Yeah, it was a regular ceremony. Superintendent of schools was there, our pastor was there, and they actually put the pew up on the stage as if it would, as it would look in the guidance department. And the choir sang Paul Robeson's song, and the band was there, and tears just came down my eye because I remember those pews, and it is beautiful. And then I said, well, we have to let this pew be known. And the Smithsonian Institution came to a storage and took one of the pews. Huh. And I have the letter that they gave me to say that they had that pew. So that's how important those pews were.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
Yeah. Paul Robeson sat in those pews, and a lot of people sat in those. And they said they weren't comfortable, but hey, you're only in church for an hour. Sometime you're in that church a little longer than that, but yeah.
It's all part of the sacrifice.
But yes, I'm in a lot in Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. And when it was first started, it was called the First Presbyterian Church of Color in Princeton. Yeah.
So Shirley, I really want to thank you for being here today. I think it's just amazing all that you've done, all that you continue to do. And, so you retired from your guidance counselor position at the high school. You've done all this stuff. So you've never really retired. I mean, you're busy, you're everywhere, you're involved in so much. Mm-hmm. Are you ever going to really retire? Are you ever going to slow down?
No, when I did retire in 2000 because I had double knee replacement and I could retire. And but they called me back for the next 6 years. So, but I couldn't go back as a guidance counselor, but I did all guidance counselor stuff, And, but no, I just like what I do, My passion is the history and the children. Yeah.
Well, it shows. And on behalf of the entire community, thank you so much for all you do. And, thank you for being here today and sharing this with everybody.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's been great. Thank you.
Ma smiling down on you.
Makes it worth it.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the 23rd episode of the Princeton Podcast, produced as a community service by HG Media, providing audio, video, and website design services here in Princeton since 1999. For more information on this episode, please visit our website, princetonpodcast.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. And be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts.